recording started here. Okay, so it's just you and I here, Mark. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So we are, can you see the screen okay?
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to be troubleshooting C#. More specifically, we're going to be troubleshooting an ASP.NET Core MVC application. Actually, it's an API application, a web API. There's going to be some things in here that if you don't know, please feel free to stop me and say, hey, I got a question about that. But I can't really obviously take up the whole time answering questions, but I will try to, if there's something that definitely is pertinent to what we're working on, then please, by all means, say, hey, Steve, can you help me out with this? Because this is really intended to be something where it is interactive. I'm going to ask you guys to do things. I'm going to ask you guys questions. I'm going to have you guys actually kind of go through some of this stuff too. So it's not just going to be me fixing the issue. I'm going to have you actually walk through the troubleshooting process as well. Because one of the things that is really important to me as an instructor is to prepare you guys for the world that you will be getting into. And as a junior developer, one of the primary tasks that junior developers have is to fix problems with already existing code. You are rarely going to be just like, here's a new feature, go build it. It's typically, here's a problem that we're having with a ticket, and I want you to go fix it, or at least identify what the problem is. So troubleshooting in C# really is, I kind of consider the troubleshooting process to be two stages. Number one is locating the source of the problem, and then number two is solving the problem. A lot of times when we are trying to fix an issue, we don't really do one very well. We don't really do the first step very well. We just kind of say it's not working, and we just kind of frazzle our brains and try to throw anything at it that we can to make it work. And we don't really typically go through and try to find the source of the problem. So I'm going to start off with, I have a project. I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code here. And I have a project that is not this one. I got to actually open up the right project. Let me open up the folder here. And there is a bug in it. There is a bug that I intended to have in here. And it's going to be our job to go through and figure out how to fix it. Okay. So the first thing that we should probably do is actually run the application, right, to see what is going on. So along with Visual Studio Code, I'm also going to open up Postman. And Postman, if you don't know, is a way for us to interact with any website, okay, any HTTP or HTTPS website or endpoint that we would talk to. So that includes web APIs, that includes websites. So it doesn't really matter what the website or web host is sending back to us, we can inspect it with Postman. And I'm going to wait for that to load up. While that's going, I'm going to go ahead and get my application up and running. So I'm just going to do a control tick here to open up the terminal window. Have you been using Visual Studio Code to do your React?
Yes.
Okay, good. So you should be familiar with Visual Studio Code. Did you see Postman at all? Was that something that you've seen at all?
No, we haven't seen anything like that yet.
Okay, that's not a problem. Postman is really kind of a troubleshooting toolbox for talking to a back end. What you have learned up to this point is the front end. Okay, you've learned HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and of course React as your front end framework. That is just what the user sees, right? What you've coded is what the user sees, with a little bit of talking to some other application to get information, right? You may talk to a MongoDB database. You may talk to like Google Maps or GitHub's API or even Facebook's API or something like that. But there's some sort of service out there, right? That is, you can make a request to the service and the service sends you back a response. And what Postman allows us to do is to really kind of inspect those requests and those responses. So I'm going to go ahead and do a .NET run, which .NET run is actually the command that we issue to run a .NET Core application. If you've done any C# development in the past, you have probably worked with the .NET framework, and .NET Core is not the .NET framework. They are two different things now. As a matter of fact, .NET framework is going by the wayside. They are pretty much dropping .NET framework. It's not going to be supported in the near future. .NET Core is a subset of .NET Standard. And .NET Standard is kind of the new mantle for what was .NET Framework. But it's been completely redone. Completely. Like they're throwing everything out that existed with Framework and creating something new with Standard. Okay? Now, .NET Core is a subset of Standard. Core is a very specific subset of the Standard. And Core is a subset that works on all platforms. So Apple, Linux, and Windows. You can run a Core application on any of the platforms. .NET Standard is still kind of tied to a Windows box. So you can still do you can still build for Windows like forms and UWP and stuff like that. .NET Core is a very small subset of libraries that is permitted to work on any cross-platform system. So Linux, Apple, or Windows. Now, I am running a new web application on this port here, localhost port 5000. So this is my local system. I have some controllers in here. I'll just show you the values controller, which comes out of the box. This is from a web API template. This is the first controller that we get. And the way that we can find it is through routing here. So I can go to this localhost port 5000, and I can do /API / and I'm just going to look, the controller name is values. So it's going to be API values / if I passed in an ID, I'd get that one. But we're just going to do a get action on this location, on the API values, okay? And this is the way that we talk to a web application, is we have a method type, get, post, put, patch, delete, copy, etc. These are essentially different commands or types of requests, okay? Because you've got a front end that's making a request to a back end. What is the format? Like, what's the convention by which we talk to a web server? And one of those things that we do is a get method, which essentially is a read option. You can think of this in terms of a database, right? We have CRUD functionality within a database. We have create, read, update, and delete. So a database has create, read, update, and delete. And essentially a web API has those same four functions, except they're in terms of get, post, put, and delete. I'm going to ignore patch for right now, but get, post, put, and delete essentially are the CRUD functionality within an API. Get is a read. Post is a create. Put is an update. Delete is delete. Okay? So essentially by sending the specific method to an API, in this case a get method, you're essentially telling the API, hey, go get that information for me. I want to read that information. Okay? So it's like a read operation in a database. And I'm going to do a get operation at this particular route called API values, which is actually mapped, okay, through, because I have these routing attributes that basically says at the API route, look for the controller. This is a placeholder for the name of the controller, and the name of my controller is values. So therefore, if I go to API values and I do an HTTP GET action, I will land on this function here in my C# code, which will return a string array of value 1 and value 2. So if I do this request, what I'm going to get back as a response is just simply value 1 and value 2 as an array. Okay, and this is JSON. This is a JSON array of 2 strings. Okay, it is coming back to us as a JSON object essentially. So that is how we can do that particular one. Now I have a books controller that I created that is broken. If I do so the route that I set up for this books controller is API, and then the controller name is books. So we're going to do API books. And if I do just an API books, I have an HTTP GET request, which will return for me all of my books, which I only have one for this demonstration. I don't need a whole bunch. But I have an ID of 1, I have a title for the book, and I have an author, which is set to null. Now, if I try to run this one here of get authors, now I have a placeholder here in my HTTP GET, which basically says, which basically is if I call this get authors function name or the action name, then it will call this get authors action. So my request needs to go API books and then the name of the action, which is get authors. So I'm going to do this get authors. And when I click send here, I have a bad array message. And also if I scroll down here, if I take a look at my terminal window, I have an error. So what do you suppose the first thing is that I should do in order to try to resolve this problem?
Well, I guess I would read the error messages and find out where they're occurring, what it's telling you.
Correct. Yep. The first thing you want to do is you want to check what the error messages are. You're absolutely right. So are we getting an error message here? And the answer is not really, because we're getting a status of 200 OK, which is kind of an interesting result, but it's basically saying a bad array. This is a perfectly valid response though, because we're getting a 200. So it's not, we're not really getting the API is not really telling us what's specifically wrong. It's just saying that there's a bad array. It isn't until we actually look at the terminal that we can see what the errors are. Now, this looks like a lot of gobbledygook, and a lot of people get like flustered because they see all this stack trace information and they get really, really thrown off. But the bottom line is, if you look towards the very beginning of where the error happens, you can start to extract some pretty interesting information. An unhandled exception was thrown by the application, which an unhandled exception basically means I have some sort of error that is not inside of a try-catch block. In other words, there's an error, there's an actual runtime error. When I try to run and do this code, something is broken, and I don't know what it is. Okay, you don't have anything that handles this particular error or this exception. Now, an unhandled exception was thrown by the application. In C#, exceptions are an actual thing. They're an object. And in this particular case, the one that we see here is system.NullReferenceException. Object reference not set to an instance of an object. So we actually can see right on basically the first 2 or 3 lines here what the error was, and we even get a special message that tells us exactly what went wrong. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to switch over to, I'm going to have to go to my, hold on here, let's see if I can move this over. So I'm going to have to open up, the next thing to do is to take any sort of message that we get and let's research it. So that's going to require some sort of searching. And of course, I'm a big fan of the Google search engine. Bing is perfectly fine to do as well. But essentially what we need to do is we need to get this error message. And I recommend the message that actually that actually has the exception issue in it directly. So we can actually see what the object exception is, as well as the message that comes along with that exception. So because we're getting a very explicit, very specific message about what the problem is, and we're getting a very specific exception object, as specific as we can possibly get means the better the chances of our results when we do a search. So when we're doing this research to go find the answers to this problem, the more specific we can get with our search, the better. And luckily for us, we're getting a very specific error message with a very specific object that tells us what the error is. So I'm going to just simply copy that, and I'm going to go back to my Google here, and I'm just going to paste that. And now it's a matter of how do we discern what result will give us the answer to what we are encountering. What's the problem? Okay, we've identified essentially like the error message. And even if we look at the error message itself, if I look at, so there's actually a message here in the books controller get authors message. We even have the line, bookscontroller.cs line 30 is where the error occurred. So I can actually see exactly which file, the books controller, line 30 is where the problem happens. Books controller, line 30. So something is wrong with this error message, or something is wrong with this line of code, okay? Something is happening. The code is trying to do this thing, and it's having a problem. So let's go back to our search results and see if we can kind of glean from any of these answers what might be the problem. So I have some code that executes, throws a null reference exception saying object reference. What does this mean and what can I do to fix the error? So their question matches pretty close to what it is that we're dealing with. Let's see if we can find an answer. So here's the recommended answer on Stack Overflow, which is usually the best place to look, is whatever the ones that is marked as correct is usually the best one to look at to see if we can solve our problem. So you're trying to use something that is null or nothing. This means you either set it to null or you never set it to anything at all. So something is set to null. And like anything else, null gets passed around. If the null in method A, it could be a method B that passed to null to method A. The rest of this article goes into more detail and shows mistakes that many programmers often make, which can lead to null reference exception. Now, if we were to go through, and I'm just going to highlight where specifically the error kind of comes from, and it's this indirect one. Okay, it's an indirect error. So if we kept looking through, and this is a very well-detailed, blow-by-blow, what might be one of the reasons why you're getting the error. And I already know ahead of time which one it is, and it's this indirect error. So in this particular case, what's happening is, and we can see in from their code, now notice that their code doesn't specifically match my code, right? Well, it does actually come pretty darn close, but there are some differences. So they have a person class, a book class, and an example function, or example class. They're trying to call foo, and foo creates a new book and then tries to get the author age from author. But the problem is that where does book, a new instance of a book, where do we see that the author is set for the book? And the answer is it's not. We're trying to access this age property on an author that hasn't been set, because all that the code did at this particular point was create a new instance of a book but never set the author property of the book. Yet here this code is trying to go get information from that author property. But there is no author. It's set to null right now because it's nothing. There's nothing there. It was never set. So let's take a look back at our code here, and let's see if there is something in our code that we're trying to access where we don't actually have a thing, where maybe it's set to null. And sure enough, on this line of code, we see both the first name property and the last name property are trying to access this author property of a book. So maybe we need to take a look and see if where this book is being created from, where is it coming from? Now, if you were to go through the code, and if you were a bit more, if you had gone through, if you were in the ASP.NET Core course, you would know to go look through this thing called a context to see if we can find the books. There's a books on our context, which is essentially our link to our database. Okay, this context is essentially a class object that is a representation in code of our database. And on our database, there is a table called books. And on that books table, we're trying to sort through the books and select, we're trying to create basically a first name and a last name for each one of the authors associated with each one of the books. And what we're trying to do is get that information from out of the database, and we're trying to then get the author information from that database. Now, if we were to dig a little bit deeper and see, okay, where is this database? Where are we connecting to the database? So we might want to take a look at our database. We might want to open our database, see what the data says inside of our database, and see if there's even an author associated with the book. Because is there an author with a book? We don't know. Well, if we take a look at the database, we might see whether or not there might be an author that's missing for a book. Maybe we have a book in our database, but no author. And that's actually what's going on. We have a book in our database without an author. So how are we going to get the first name and last name from an author that doesn't exist on a book, right? And we can actually see that if we did our books request. Remember that when we did this, we saw the author property on our book is set to null, right?
Yes.
So how are we then going to get the first name and last name for an author that's set to null? Look at that. We even see right there, null. So therefore, the error that we're getting of null reference exception, object reference not set to an instance of an object, we can see right there when we try to access all the books, author property is set to null. Therefore, we can't get a first name and last name from an author for a book that doesn't even have an author. So that's what we need to solve. We need to solve that. Now, the way that this application is set up is that at the very beginning of our application, we're setting it up to use a in-memory database, which essentially mimics what a real database would be like. And then we also run this initialize function on an initialized database class. So here's our initialized database class, and here's where we initialize a database. And what we'll see is that when we add a book, we're checking to see if the book, if there are any books. If there aren't any books, then go ahead and add this book of The Great Gatsby, and then save the changes. But notice that we are not adding an author, and that's the core of the problem. We have not added to our database any author associated with this book. So what we need to do then is we need to go ahead and add an author. We could go ahead and do it. I would say we should probably put this author thing up here first. There's several different ways that we can solve this, and ideally this is where I would actually end the workshop because we've identified where the problem is. We've gone through the troubleshooting steps to look at what the error message tells us. We've gone through and done a proper search of the error message. We've parsed through the information of Stack Overflow to try to locate the best answer. And I kind of skipped over and skimmed over and kind of showed you where the best answer was. And now we're at the point where we actually have the problem identified and even the source of the problem. So, and here's one of the critical things to understand about this troubleshooting process, is that not only is it sufficient to just find a line of code that is broken, but also try to trace the logic that led us to the breakage. And that's where we're going, right? We can see that we can identify easily with the error message which line of code is broken. But that doesn't tell the whole story, right? We have to try to look at this line of code and try to deduce, why is that error message happening on that thing? And if we look on line 30 of our books controller class, we will see that we are trying to access the first name and last name of an author that may not even exist. And that's, whenever I see null reference exception in C#, that's an immediate, like that tells me I'm trying to access a property on something that is set to null. That's what that means. I am trying to access a property on an object which is currently set to null. And in this case, that object that is set to null is the author of this book. And again, like we pointed out, that's because back here in our initialize where we're seeding the database. And seeding a database is essentially where your code actually goes to the database and sets some values into that database to start our application. This is a very common technique because like when you first create an application, you probably need some sort of like, if you have logins, for example, you probably need some sort of administrator account, right? So this is how you would go through and seed the database with some like default data, like a default admin account that allows them to access the system. In this case, this particular seeding process or initialization process was adding books and adding authors or adding people, but we never added an author to this particular book, and that was the problem. So at this particular stage, what I would suggest to you as something for you to go work on is to solve this particular problem yourself. Like, how would you actually write the code to fix this issue? I've pointed out where the error code is and the source of the error. So now it's up to you to figure out how to solve and make that error go away and make it work properly. That solution is going to be different for different people. Different developers are going to come up with different ways to solve it. So that's why I'm not going to like just tell you how I would do it. There's lots of different ways. I'm going to let you guys explore that. If you want to see this code, I do have it. If you want to like glean it from GitHub, I have it out here on my GitHub repository. And I will send you guys this link. Where to go? Where to go? Workshop. Did I not give it? Okay, I will. I thought that I had it in here, but I guess not. Let me. I need to do that. I will make sure that we get this this NetCore workshop posted up on GitHub, and I will send Mark and Bo. I will send you both, or maybe because I want to make sure you guys have access to this. Oh, come on, go away. Before I do any of that, do you guys have any questions?
No, sir. I think that made sense.
Yeah?
Yes, sir.
All right, good. And the video for this will be posted up pretty soon on our Vimeo workshop link. I'm going to make the announcement. I'm going to change the announcements. I believe, Mark, since you're in databases, you either have Isaac or Cassandra as your instructor. And so keep your eye on the announcements to see if that there's probably going to be a link to the workshop's playlist. So you should see this video listed up there once I get it all posted and everything. So this is going to be the link. I haven't got the code up here just yet, but I will shortly. I'll go ahead and send this to you guys in a chat. That will be the repository where I'm going to store this information once I get it saved. So You guys can keep your eye on there. And you can go ahead and try to solve this particular problem. See if you can fix the code so that it actually works. Okay?
Okay.
All right. Any additional questions before I wrap it up here?
No, sir. I think I'm good.
All right. How do you like the workshop?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It kind of confirms some of the things that I do when I'm troubleshooting. And it was helpful just to confirm that and to watch it in something particularly that I'm not super familiar with, that, you know, the similar technique and what I am working with.
Yeah, it's the same troubleshooting process for pretty much every programming language. Somewhere, someplace, there's going to be a log that tells you what the error is. You just got to go search it. Stack Overflow is by far one of the best places to go to get the answer to your question resolved, right? It's by far one of the best places that all us developers go to try to find our answers. I'd say probably about 75% of the questions I've ever asked has been answered by Stack Overflow. The other 25% are either I find it on someone's blog post, or I've just not been able to find a result at all and had to figure it out myself through a series of other blog posts or Stack Overflow posts. Okay, well, you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. I will be doing next week some more of these workshops. So if you guys want to join them, just, again, schedule them like you just did this last time. Okay.
All right. Well, thanks, Steve.
You're welcome.
Thank you.